I was born and came of age in the Cold War, which was a bipolar world. It was the United States versus the Soviet Union. And then, of course, in 1989, maybe 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we went from bipolarity to unipolarity. And that was just a huge change. One cannot underestimate how much that affected international politics. And I would note that one of the problems is that most people today who are involved in the policy process or involved as commentators came of age during the unipolar moment, not during the bipolar moment or the bipolar era of the Cold War. And they got used to a situation during unipolarity where the United States and its European allies were extremely powerful and had all sorts of leverage all around the world. There were countries like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, of course, that were unhappy with that situation, but there was not much they could do about it because there was a unipole. That was the United States, and it was backed to the hilt by the Europeans. But what happens, in my opinion, around 2017, we can argue about exactly when the world went from unipolarity to multipolarity, but we moved out of a unipolar world into a multipolar world. And it's very important, Glenn, to understand that this is the first time since 1945, before the Cold War, that we've been in a multipolar world. And a multipolar world is different than a bipolar world. A bipolar world is a rather simple world because you have two great powers, they're face to face, and they, in a very important way, kind of divide up the world between themselves. That's an oversimplification, but it sort of gets at the essence of what's going on in bipolarity. But in a multipolar world, like the one that we live in, you have three different great powers, and you also have a host of major powers, countries that are not quite great powers, but wield a lot of influence in the system. And India would fit in this situation or in this category. So we're now in this multipolar world. But the problem is that we have all these policymakers and pundits and policy analysts who grew up in unipolarity, and they're used to thinking of the world in terms of unipolarity. And many of them still think that the United States is Godzilla and that it can use its economic leverage and its military might to get its way wherever it wants. But that world has gone away. And you're now talking about, from an American perspective, dealing with the United States, excuse me, dealing with Russia and dealing with China, two great powers. And then you have to deal with countries like India, countries like Turkey, countries like Iran. There are a lot of other important players in the system that you have to deal with. So it's a very complicated world. And also in this world, America's power has diminished, not in an absolute sense. Economically and militarily, we've grown more powerful over time, but relative to the other states in the system, we've lost power. The United States now faces a peer competitor in China. The China that the United States faces today is fundamentally different than the China it faced in 1990 or the China that it faced in 2000. And therefore, the United States has to deal differently with China today than it has in the past. And again, I think most American policymakers and policy analysts and pundits haven't really come to terms with that. They're just limits to what we can do, we meaning the United States. And really, it's not just the United States, it's the United States and the West. So the world that we're in today is just fundamentally different than the world that most people who are in the policy process these days came of age in.
Well, realists tend to differ a bit of what order is most stable. I was always a bit critical of the ability of stability in the bipolar system, simply because if there's two major powers, one side loses, the other side gains, and it sets everything very sharp in zero sum. But I was of the idea that if you have a third pole or fourth pole, that if A and B weaken each other, then C will come off and be much stronger. So in the 19th century, you had the British and the Russians going against each other, and suddenly you have America, Germany, Japan, all these other new centers of power emerging. But how do you see, how do you make sense of what's happening now though with the United States and Russia, India, China? Because we just had this meeting at the SCO, and it looked like Trump, he had the right instincts for a while. He more or less repeated the Kissinger caution that we should not push the Russians into the hands of the Chinese. But what happened with India, though? This is very strange actions which were made. This punishment and even humiliation of the Indians, which made them align themselves much closer with these two other Eurasian giants.
Well, if you look at what the Trump administration is doing uh, with regard to the alliance structure that it's trying to set up or not set up, it makes no sense at all from a balance of power perspective. It's very important to start by emphasizing that China is a peer competitor of the United States. There's really only one great power in the system that can give the United States a run for its money, and that's China. China is a formidable opponent of the United States, both economically and militarily. So if you're in a system where China is your principal concern, and you want to contain China, you want to contain China's rise. This is not to argue that you want to start World War III against China, but you want to prevent China from dominating Asia. You then, excuse me, Glenn, you then want to have good relations uh, with Russia, and you want to have good relations with India because you don't want them on the Chinese side of the ledger. But what the Trump administration has done by continuing the war in Ukraine and treating the Russians quite badly, despite what happened in Alaska, is in effect continue to push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And now what's happened is that as a result of putting 50% tariffs on India and saying all sorts of terrible things about India, Trump has driven the Indians into the arms of the Chinese. So as we recently saw at the SCO meeting in Tianjin in China, the Indians, the Russians, and the Chinese are all becoming the best of friends, which again is not in the American national interest. What the Americans should want is a situation where India, Russia, and the United States are the best of friends. But exactly the opposite has happened. This is just not in our strategic interest. And one can only scratch his or her head and ask, what do the Americans think they're doing? Or to put it more pointedly, what does President Trump think he's doing? It's a gross violation of balance of power logic. We live in a multipolar world. The Trump administration believes to a person that China has to be contained. Well, if you believe China has to be contained, pushing the Russians and the Indians into the arms of the Chinese just makes no sense at all. And you can take this even further, Glenn. You can talk about countries like Iran and countries like North Korea as well. What we see happening here is that the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians have all come together to, in effect, balance against the United States. Uh, the Europeans, who of course work with the Americans on the Iran issue, uh, the Europeans have now pushed for snapback sanctions on Iran. Uh, as you know, with the JCPOA, the agreement between Iran and the United States, China, Russia, Germany, France, and Britain, that JCPOA agreement in 2015, we took sanctions, all sorts of sanctions, off of Iran. Uh, most in theory, not in practice. But anyway, the argument was that if one member of that group decided to put snapback sanctions, to put the sanctions back on Iran, everybody would go along with that. Well, the Europeans want to put snapback sanctions. They want to put the sanctions back on Iran. And the Russian foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister, and the Iranian foreign minister have just issued a statement saying they consider these snapback sanctions illegal, wrong, and counterproductive, and they're not going to pay any attention to them. So what you see here is that that unified front to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons in 2015 has broken down. And the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese are working together. And in fact, the Russians and the Chinese are helping the Iranians build up their defenses for another possible attack from Israel and the United States. So, if anything, U.S. Iranian relations have deteriorated, making it more difficult to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and making it more likely that the United States will end up attacking Iran again, which is not in our national interest. We should have good relations with Iran. We should be going to great lengths to get help from the Russians and the Chinese to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. But instead, we're cutting in the other direction, and we're pushing the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Koreans together. And of course, just a word or two about the North Koreans. If you noticed, when they just had this big celebration this past week in Beijing, celebrating the end of World War II in Asia, North Korea's leader, China's leader, and Russia's leader, they were all there together, arm in arm, celebrating the victory. So you can see very clearly what's happened here. We've driven these four countries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, closer together, which is not in our interest. And now we've pushed the Indians into that same uh, uh, arrangement, into that same coalition. This makes absolutely no sense from an American point of view.